this year, and I'm delighted to moderate the panel on legal careers in litigation funding. We've got an amazing panel, so I'm going to just kick it off. And one thing I wanted to say is I was reading a little bit about this before, over the last week, and so I came across an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it kind of sets it up real well. It says lawyers at top rungs of the legal profession are moving to a part of the industry that just a few years ago was largely unknown. Litigation finance firms, which invest money in corporate legal disputes, are raising hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions, and staffing up to put that money to work. The funders are attracting lawyers from elite law firms, including Arnold and Porter, Latham and Watkins, Proskauer, Wachtel, and so on. The roles are seen as more entrepreneurial than those at the rigid, bill-by-the-hour firms. This is so the article goes on and on and says this is hot and this is something that is really taking off. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about this. What are these careers and how do you position yourself for that? So we're going to turn it over. We've got an amazing group of panelists. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce the panelists, throw out a couple questions, and towards the end of the hour, turn it over to any questions that you might have in the audience. And we're playing for this audience, but also this program is being taped as well. So we expect lots of people to be watching it later too. So let's introduce our panelists. And without further ado, let's start out. Let me just get my introductions. Emily, to my left is Emily Hostage. She's the vice president at Burford Capital. And prior to joining Burford, Emily was vice president of strategic analytics and policy at RPX Corporation, a leading global provider of patent risk management services. Previously, Ms. Hostage practiced law at Arnold & Porter, where she represented high-tech clients in patent, copyright, and trade secret litigation cases. Emily obtained her JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she also served as the executive director of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. To Emily's left is Ian Cunningham. Ian is the founder and CEO of Affinity Finance, and Ian is the chairman of the firm's investment committee. He brings to the company 8 years of experience owning, running, and funding similar litigation lending businesses in Southern Ireland. He has an excellent track record in the litigation sector, having funded over 250 successful cases to date. Ian started his working career at the FBD PLC in Dublin, where he spent a number of years in the sales and marketing department. He was the youngest ever top sales achiever in the country. Ian also has extensive experience evaluating mortgage and insurance risk. His passion in horses is playing football and golf at the highest level, and enjoys a great litigation funding podcast. To Ian's left is Elizabeth Korchin, a senior investment officer at Therium. Elizabeth is an investment officer at Therium in New York, where she focuses on legal diligence, investment structuring, and navigating ethics issues and litigation funding. Prior to joining Therium, Elizabeth practiced as a litigation and arbitration partner at Hogan Lovells in New York and Washington, D.C. Elizabeth received her Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School in 2008 and her undergraduate degree from Duke in 2005. And finally, to Elizabeth's left is Selvin Seidel, the founder and chairman of Fulbright Capital Management. In 2007, and before Fulbright or Burford, Mr. Seidel founded and chaired Burford Advisors, an expert advisor in dispute finance. As noted, in 2009, he co-founded and chaired Burford Capital Group, the investment manager for Burford Capital LLC. Burford Capital was taken public on the UK AIM market of the London Exchange and is now the largest with over $3 billion under management and the most respected institutional financing providers in the world. Mr. Seidel is recognized in the industry as a pioneering voice. He has been described as probably the front runner in the industry and obviously a huge leader. Before Burford and Fulbright, Mr. Seidel practiced as a litigation attorney for over 40 years in complex litigations and arbitration, specializing in international disputes. In 1985, he co-founded the New York office of Latham and Watkins, and until December 31, 2006, he practiced there and was a senior litigation partner, and at different times the chairman of the firm's international practice. All of this to say, as you hear the backgrounds of the panelists, we've got an amazing group here to talk about not only the area of what this is, but how to go about positioning yourself. So before turning over some questions, please join me in welcoming this fantastic panel. So let's turn it over now. Thank you. I guess just because anyone who will be watching or is coming in and out of today's session, I wonder if we could start with a real basic question of just to explain to someone who might not be familiar with exactly what is litigation funding or litigation finance. In a nutshell, what is it? And then we'll get a little bit deeper into it. Elizabeth or Selman, do you want to take that?
Let me take that very quickly. It's nothing that's very complicated on the surface. It's very complicated when you dive into it. But on the surface, which is all you need to know, it is a third party coming in to give the claimant in a litigation or a dispute before the litigation has started or the arbitration has started, money based on the security of the claim itself. So if the claim has a $100 million projection, it might be worth $50 million, and you might invest $2 or $3 million to pursue it. One thing that's all it is. I must add some of the complications because it's not very simple. What you can do is you can do this monetization for a worthwhile claim, not only for litigation fees, but for money for the claimant to run its business, to pay its children's tuition, his or her children's tuition. It has developed a great deal since its beginning. In the U.S., it was probably around 2005, and it's grown like topsy, so it's used for that, and it's used now for many other things. It will be a product that's traded, I predict, without fail, it'll be traded on public exchanges like the stock exchange before long. That's part of its future.
Well, thank you. Let's start out, and maybe we'll start out, why don't we throw this to you, Emily. When you were a student at law school, were you even aware of litigation funding?
No.
So how did you learn about it? And then the follow-up is, once you learned about it, how did you get into it?
How did I end up here? I suppose I stumbled into it like a lot of people who really enjoy what they do find things. Before law school, my background was in electrical engineering. I studied that undergrad and as a master's, and I focused on signal processing, information theory, probabilistic science. So I came with a quantitative lens to the legal profession from the start. My practice in litigation, by virtue of the time in which I graduated, substantially was intellectual property litigation, but it always was sort of from a quantitative perspective. So my work at RPX was focused on collecting, aggregating public and proprietary data to give some insight into the patterns that we see in disputes. And hopefully not just in disputes, but in general in the legal market writ large. So I came to know Burford through a mutual connection and realized how much more extensible that discipline would be outside of the narrow context in which I was practicing it at the time. So what I realized at Burford is that I would have an opportunity to view disputes or to just view legal risk through a more holistic or aggregate lens and use my quantitative background to deploy services in that market or deploy capital in that market in a way that might perhaps make it more efficient or more accessible in certain segments of that market.
Okay, so Ian, I'm wondering, do you need to be an attorney to be working in this area? Well, everybody here, a lot of folks are attorneys in the field. Do you need to be an attorney to work in this area?
You certainly don't need to be, but what it does help to have attorneys around you, for certain. I come from a financial background myself. As you said, when I wasn't playing golf and football, I was brought up in a claims division, so therefore I've come from a completely defendants claims department. Very interested at all times how claims were worked through that system, because I felt there was meritorious claims coming into our own departments which the insurer did not want to pay. They were always looking to get out. So to answer your question, you certainly don't need to be a lawyer, but certainly from investors' point of view and from running a good litigation funder, it is very, very practical. It makes sense to have them around you. So we have insurance people working in our departments, we have actuaries, we have a lot of analysts, so we have a broad spectrum of people across a various range of skill sets that we tap into from time to time.
Well, thank you. And Elizabeth, so you were a partner at Hogan Lovells before you made the change. So I'm curious, is this something as a student sitting in the audience can do? The analogy I would use is, a lot of students will say, I want to do mediation and arbitration. But you see, the most people who are doing that are very experienced or oftentimes retired judges who will be doing a lot of the mediation and arbitration. How does that translate into this area? Because you were a partner before you moved over to Therium.
Exactly. So it is incredibly difficult and, in fact, arguably impossible, I think, to just graduate from law school and find a career in litigation finance. Unlike some of my colleagues here on the panel, I'm probably one of the few people that did not find litigation funding. It actually found me. I had a very broad practice in litigation and arbitration. Pretty much the one thing that linked my practice together was there was a technology aspect, but really the way that I fell into my practice was I wasn't afraid to tackle new things that I didn't have experience in. And that kind of relying on my instincts has come to serve me well, and was the reason that our chief investment officer came and found me and said, we just closed a new fund, we need help deploying it, we have more in our pipeline than we can really deal with, and we're seeing things from all across the spectrum. We need somebody with your broad experience and the ability to jump into things and not be afraid to tackle areas that you're not well versed in, but you've seen enough out there in the industry to really have those instincts developed. So like your example on mediation arbitration, I don't know that it's something that on day one you can just find yourself in a career. It's possible. I think as the industry keeps growing, there will be more need for legal analysts, maybe at the lower levels, just doing research. But for me, what's really exciting about the career is we get the legal components, the finance components. At Therium, we're a very well-established and large fund. We just crossed the $1 billion mark in funds raised. We've been in the industry for 10 years, but as many of the other panelists today have expressed, it's still a new industry, so we're still building a business, and that for me is really the fun part. It's the same thing that I was bringing to my legal practice at Hogan Lovells of not being afraid to try new things. I think there are all sorts of products and services that we can provide as legal financiers that have not even yet been conceived.
So I'm just curious before we move on, and I wanted to go again to Sullivan. What was the calculus in your mind? You're a partner at a top firm in one of the nation's top firms, and you walked away from the partnership. What was the calculus? How did you make that decision?
It was a combination of things, and just to add to that story, I had made partner 6 months before this big leap, and actually the opportunity presented itself to me about 3 months into that. So it was certainly not anything that I had ever dreamed of. On the flip side, it was the one thing that I had thought, this is something that really hits all the check marks for things that I would like to do in my career. I was always the person who loved dealing with spreadsheets and modeling out different aspects of my cases as a litigator. And so I thought this is something that really could fulfill a lot of my desires. Therium in particular is a very flat organization, and so they really offered to me an opportunity that paralleled what I had at Hogan Lovells, and I was particularly drawn at that time to the notion of really getting into an industry in its early phases. I always had an entrepreneurial streak, and I thought this is just a chance for me to really flourish in the things that I enjoy doing. But it wasn't a decision I took lightly. It was, I had spent almost 10 years climbing that ladder, and not without the help of very many friends at my firm who I still, very much wish that I had a day-to-day relationship with, because it was just a wonderful experience at Hogan Lovells. But now I actually continue to work with all of them just from a funding perspective, and get to do kind of all the broad things that I loved about my practice. And as I saw as a partner, the increasing pressures to specialize, this was a way to actually broaden even farther than where I already was.
So turning over to the pioneer and one of the founders of this.
You're an amazing case. I was just saying to Elizabeth, she is an amazing case study for all that's going on.
Absolutely. But I want to turn this question to you, Selvin. As the pioneer or a founder, so we're looking at the industry and thinking about it from the career lens. What are the skills that you think are necessary to, embark on a career in litigation funding?
I think that question, Mark, is right on the mark. And I think, again, I'll look at Elizabeth and Ian as two examples. It's a very, first of all, the industry draws on as I've said before, an integration of law, finance, business, professions, other professions, and that is really unique because there is no other, in fact, it's illegal in the sense that in the U.S., it's still illegal for partners of law firms to be non-lawyers. That's different in the UK, and it will be different in the US. But right now, the broader the integration, the better. That's number one. Number two, the industry is very much looking for people who have this sort of pioneering spirit, as you just heard with Elizabeth. That's unbelievable to think that someone 6 months into a partnership will leave a prestigious law practice to go into funding. That's unheard of. It takes a great deal of boldness and strength. Now, what does this industry therefore hold for careers? And this is one of the things, Mark, that I think is very important to this course and to what Harvard is doing, this symposium and what Harvard is doing. This area, litigation finance, provides career opportunities that will go on forever. And I'll come back to specific time periods in a moment, because it gives graduating students an opportunity to make a career out of litigation finance at a law firm, they can go there. There are more and more firms that are becoming funder-friendly as well as partners with funders, so they can help that law firm understand this very complex industry, and that is certainly a career path. Then they can, if they wish, go with a funder, and they can succeed there as well. I agree almost with Elizabeth that it's very hard to go directly with a funder out of law school, but that's possible, as Lee Drucker, who was here on the panel before, is a good illustration. He went directly from NYU Law School into funding with me, actually, and then he went out on his own, and he's done spectacularly well. So it's not impossible, it's just much harder to do that. The fact of the matter is, though, that this will be a terrific career for graduates of law school and business school particularly. And how long will that go on? Well, I predict that this opportunity will continue. It's for another 10 years at its white-hot pace, and then for another 20 years at a hot pace. So you're looking at a generation of growth, and that's based on a number of different things that I can itemize for you, but I think that's the bottom line, that this is going to remain a hot career path for many years to come. I hate to sound like a salesman, but I used to sell encyclopedias. This is truly, what's going to happen in this industry is that courses will be given at law schools and business schools in the industry. In fact, the two sponsors, JP and Robert, are pushing to have a course in Harvard, which would be the first course in the law school ever. So it's becoming a part of that. Then you're going to find licensing requirements. You're going to, just like to become a lawyer, which will require competence and ethics, and then you're going to have ethical responsibilities and fiduciary responsibilities, just like lawyers have today. So there is a long path in front of this. It's not going to be easy, but it'll be very rewarding.
So I want to just turn this over to all of you, if you can each weigh in. Okay, so someone's thinking about this as maybe as a 2L or 3L, or maybe a third-year associate. They came across this. How do you position yourself for something like this? You kind of alluded, to it, but I'm wondering if we can just get some feedback from each of you. What is the best advice to students or junior attorneys? What is the knowledge base? How do you position yourself if you're at a firm to make yourself attractive to litigation funders? Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe just to answer some of your questions, and maybe Selvin, what you mentioned as well. We recently, about a year ago, reached out to a lot of the city law firms in London, and we mentioned to them that some of the undergraduates, which wouldn't be unusual in London, for to hire them 2 years out. And while they're going through their studies, we've taken on a large number of those undergraduates while they're studying, and brought them into our organisation and explained how litigation funding works, brought them into our underwriting departments and various other sectors and sections. And we have found that to be an unbelievable experience. And these people have brought innovation, creativity. In fact, some of them I don't want to let go. They've been fantastic. And I think I would suggest that all funders maybe have a think about how they could reach out to different universities. And Robert and JP, you're welcome in our firm at any time, just to let you know. But I think from that, it gives them a stepping stone, and they go and speak to their colleagues in university, and it's getting the word out there. I personally don't think, if I was setting out in my legal career, there's nothing more exciting than getting out of bed every morning and coming into this industry. It's fascinating, it's a brilliant time. I think it shows from what Elizabeth has done, leaving fantastic, obviously very friendly with our colleagues, brilliant firm, and to come into our sector it just shows where we've come and how far we've come as an industry. I think we must continue to work with young people, and that's why for Affinity it's a great honour and it's a privilege to be here today at the first one of these symposiums, which I believe will only go from strength to strength. So that is one way that we are helping and hoping to assist with younger people into the industry from an early stage.
Emily, maybe you want to weigh in? And what's interesting, I thought, with your background, Emily, because you have an expertise, you've got the IP background. I mean, what are the things that not everyone's is going to have that kind of expertise? What are some of the things that how would you advise a junior associate or a law student in terms of positioning themselves for a career in litigation funding?
Well, I guess I'll answer that question from the position of my own experience. I don't think of it so much as positioning as though I'm going to lead a target 5 or 7 years from now or what have you and get there. I tend to think about making decisions incrementally and for the sake of building skills or getting perspective that you don't currently have. So I did not go straight from a law firm to Burford Capital. I had an interim step in between, and at the time, I was told by some people in no uncertain terms that it would be the end of my career to step out of the law firm that soon. That has not been the case so far for me in my experience. And I made the jump anyway because I recognized that while I could leverage my expertise as a person who had practiced these cases at a firm, I would learn a host of different skills and perspectives inside of a company that was focused not on the provision of legal services, but on identifying weaknesses or inefficiencies in that market that another person who might have stayed at the law firm for an extra 3 or 5 years would never have learned. So I thought about it less in terms of having a certain prescribed path being necessary to getting where I wanted to go, but more diversifying my own experience and differentiating my background from other people's. So I approach practice or my work at Burford probably very differently than you, Elizabeth, because I didn't have the same longer-term partnership experience. And I think it's probably true that it would be very difficult to run a successful legal finance firm without anyone having had practice in the legal sector. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every single person at the legal finance firm has to have that level of experience or come from that same exact perspective. And I keep saying legal finance, and I'm doing this intentionally because although the conversation typically revolves around thinking of litigation funding narrowly as the provision of capital to a claimant in litigation, that's certainly sort of the entry-level product of the way that people have traditionally thought about this industry, but as Sullivan has pointed out, it has blossomed into something much more expansive and much more flexible, to the point that I would encourage you, if you're interested in this sector as a career path, think of it less like providing capital to claimants and more like an investment bank that focuses on acquiring legal risk as opposed to traditionally just business risk. To the point that we've looked at investment opportunities that turn on legal risk that has nothing to do with litigation. There are plenty of instances in mergers and acquisitions in which one of the things that a buyer is acquiring is some outstanding legal potential liability or asset that may have nothing to do with litigation. And if that buyer has no real in-house expertise or experience with such legal risk, it would be difficult for them to price that in a way that's not punitive to the seller. So I think conceiving of it broadly is a good way to think about how to position yourself, but also just not necessarily accepting that there are certain prescribed paths to the same end result. There are different ways to get to the same place, and if you follow your own instincts about what skills you're missing, what things resonate with you, what you're good at, and what you enjoy, you may very well find that opportunity open up a door from an angle you would not have anticipated.
So both of you were, went to Harvard. Looking back now, what courses do you wish you would have taken now, given where you are in your careers? Because you're probably you're learning a lot of the stuff on the job. What could you have said, God, that would have been great to learn from the best legal minds in the country when I was paying my tuition at Harvard Law School?
I'll sort of take a cop-out and say, I wish I could go through all of law school again, now having practiced as a lawyer. I think I just have a completely different view of all the classes, 10 years into my practice, and I was fascinated by the questions that we were all debating when I was here in law school, but now even more so having practiced. So, I wish that I had had the time when I was on the billable hour to just sit around and think, like, what about those civil procedure rules? I mean, we did sometimes do that in the off hours, but there's no one particular class. I think my own experience was that it was a broad base, and frankly, in some ways I was unencumbered by a real foundation. I think part of what I bring to Therium is that I'm like, why do we have to do it this way? I don't have actually, this set view on this is how this industry works, and I'm willing to question. I think that's what I brought to my law practice as well. And there are definitely uses and very valid ones for the people who are, from day one knew that they wanted to be in this industry. But I think from my own perspective, what I bring to the table is the fresh look of, okay, all I know is I've litigated these types of cases. Why are we pricing this way? Can we completely turn over the structure? And they're like, oh, yeah, actually, we've been doing it this way for a long time because that's how we do it. And my view is, well, let's try this other way. And sometimes we come up with creative solutions. So I think it's both. I think it's great to have a foundation. I welcome the views of my other colleagues here, but for me, it's really been a broad base and a willingness to kind of try new things that have been the most important in this industry.
I guess, if you want.
Can I just talk about or comment about what Elizabeth just said? I think that the best course that you might have currently is a course of your combined course of law school and business school. So you get a JD MBA in 4 years. It's well worth it because this industry is so tied into finance and business as well as law. That's number one. In the future, I predict that Harvard will have a course or courses in this particular area, and that will be courses that will be well worth taking, because the careers as a lawyer or as a funder will be there for you for a long time.
What would be the ones that are in the course catalog now? What would be like, what's a can't miss that you need to?
Well, you have now some courses on accounting for lawyers. That is one of the courses I would think you'd want to take. There are courses in behavioral. What is her name? Kathy Spiro at the law school, who's not a lawyer, but teaches on behavioral law and game theory. And that is another course that you're going to want to take because it is so behavioral law, behavioral science, finance. As one of the Harvard Business School professors just said, he teaches a course on behavioral finance. That is also a course that is already embedded in the law school curriculum. So there are courses. David Wilkins, who will be the keynote speaker tonight, who is a professor here and a noted, if not the authority in the world on legal services, his course will be an important course for anybody who's interested in finance because it's so tied to legal services and the career there. So there's plenty.
I guess one I just wanted to hit upon just to make sure, because I've heard it referred to. What about the quantitative skills? How strong do you need to be quantitatively, to have a career in this area? Or do you need it, or do you just need to surround yourself with people who have that aptitude?
I think you can surround yourself, although the studies show that physicists and nuclear scientists do well in law school and often take that path. So there is an affinity between that sort of mindset and the law. And that will, in turn, I think, lead to someone who's interested in litigation finance, I would think. But it's guesswork.
I guess maybe flip it up. Let me just flip it for a second. Sometimes when we are working with students or alums and they're trying to figure out what they want to do, sometimes we can also do the flip side. What don't you want to do? Because you can sometimes, it helps you, crystallize their focus. So I guess one question to the panelists, who shouldn't do, who is litigation funding not for? If there's certain things that are, that you say, you know what, it would not be a good career path for X. What would X be?
If you don't have an appetite for risk.
Yes, and that's most lawyers, and
Right?
they're taught that in law school, to be so conservative, not to have an appetite for risk. So I think you're right, and I think the law school experience in general drives that instinct out of people. They're so cautious, they're so risk adverse that they find this industry, the way it's currently sold, as too risky for them.
What else? So someone who is not comfortable with risk this might not be the right path. Any other things that you'd highlight?
I think if you're afraid to go against the grain and don't trust your own instincts, what I find are the best opportunities are the ones where I see something that other people don't see, either a risk, everybody's saying this is great, and I'm saying no, I'm seeing something else here, and then we all dive into it further and we see something that prevents a bad investment. Or on the flip side, I really think there's something good here, and even when other people are kind of like, I'm not seeing it, sometimes you have to be willing to stick to your convictions. And so if you're somebody who is resistant to that type of conflict, and I wouldn't say we have conflict in our office, but we certainly have heated debates that we're all very engaged in. If that's not your work style, then this might not be the industry for you.
Yeah, I guess I would add, and this might be an oversimplified way of describing it, but if you need to be also the person who implements the tactics as opposed to just conceives of the strategy and oversees it, then perhaps you're not going to get as much satisfaction out of it. We're clearly not the people standing up and arguing in court in the cases that we fund. We're there to observe, and we're there to pay attention and to have perhaps some input along the way. But if you want to be the person who writes the brief or makes the opening or closing argument, this is not the industry for you. It's not what we do. And I guess I would come from a different perspective regarding whether law school makes you risk intolerant or something like that. And I do come from a quantitative background. I tend to think that, as we all know, law school is good at teaching you how to spot issues. It's not necessarily that great, depending on what courses you take or what clinical you do. It's not quite as good at teaching you how to estimate the severity of each of those possible outcomes. Learning to be practical and to think through the final steps to something playing out in practice is a very different thing. It's not necessarily true that you have to learn all of that from day one in law school, but it's good to have some exposure to that. And if you conceive of yourself as somebody who is both academic and theoretical and strategic, but also practical, this could be a very good field.
Mark Twain had that quote, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And I think part of this is, part of it is the experiential part where you need to have some of that in order to evaluate these cases, to figure out, the direction that you're going. Is there any other, I was just curious if there was any other things that someone should avoid this career if they have an aptitude for, so for example, if someone was not innovative, do you need to be innovative innovative or creative? Do you need to have those skill sets to succeed in this area?
No, I think actually what's covered with everybody in the panel so far about you must be able to make a decision. That's the first thing. You must be able to say, yes, I support, or no. Because you sit on an investment committee, you can't say, well, we'll think about that. You have to be able to say yes or no, and that's very important. And some people can't make those decisions. And lawyers don't have to make the decision mostly when they run the case, because the judge makes the decision at the end of the day. They can tell somebody it's a 60%, 50%, 75% chance, but at the end of the day, they have a judge who they say at the end of the case, oh, well, we were unlucky with that judge on the day. We can't make those mistakes because we lose our jobs. And we need to be making decisions that are hopefully correct. And I think you're right. We need creative and innovative people around us. We need financial people around us. We also need people with people skills and are able to work with a broad spectrum of law firms, various insurance companies, different partners in this industry. And that it is a business whereby it's about relationships. And I have a brilliant relationship with all of the panelists here, and most of the funders, and I go and visit them, and I think in that way this industry is brilliant, because we do share a lot of where we believe we all should be, because obviously, as I've spoken about earlier on, there's a huge amount of business out there for all of us. The industry is at a very early stage, very immature, and there's very exciting times ahead. So I think if you have all of those skills, but risk adverse is not a place and not someone to be bothering to coming into this industry, I think it's the one thing, definitely not.
Just tacking on to what Ian just said, I think the course that might be the most important is knowing all your classmates and keeping in touch with them. I think the network is very important, and that goes, for me, and even the way that I came to Therium was somebody at Hogan Levels who I knew, in a past life, moved on to Therium actually to start the Therium New York office. And when that next funding round closed and they needed to expand, he had seen me working, we had tried a case together, and he said, okay, I'm coming to find you. I would have never fallen into it otherwise. But so I think, not to be overlooked are the people who might ultimately be the people who need funding.
Yeah, just
Mark, can I just add that one of the essential things, I think, for any good litigation financer is the ability to work with other people in other disciplines. So a lawyer working with a business person, working with a financier, maybe working with an accountant, and so on. That is so important because it really is essential to success in this industry. And what you're seeing in the U.S. will be what's going on in the UK. The UK now has a law which allows for, it's revolutionary, it allows financiers to invest in law firms. That's not allowed in the U.S. Or most other places. And they can also become partners of lawyers, non-lawyers. That's going to be a part of what happens in the U.S. eventually, and it's another indication of the importance of being able to combine the different disciplines, different professions into one umbrella that's an integrated profession.
That's a great question for David Wilkins, who
Yes.
studies the profession. I'm wondering, I have one last question, then I want to turn it over to the audience for if they have any questions. So a student who's listening here or watching this online and says, I want to learn more about this, how do they go about doing that? What should they be doing?
One thing they can readily do is read the websites of some of the leading funders, the Burford website, the Harvard Litigation website, Longford in Chicago's website. You can get a lot of information. In fact, I've recently gone through the Burford annual report, and it is a tremendous education for what goes on in funding. Beyond that, there's not a lot of publications. There are a lot of articles. There are very few books that are on this. There's a couple that can be recommended, but there are very, very few. You can, I think, mostly learn by experience. There's no substitute for this. It's a key to success in this industry, and that's nothing more than age, which none of these people have, but I have. So it really just takes some time and experience.
You mentioned that some firms are litigation funding friendly.
Yes.
And how would someone find that information?
It's becoming well known now. You can look it up in some of the places which advertise it, but you can look at Kirkland Ellis, you can look at Quinn Emanuel, you can look at Hogan. These are firms.
Is Latham?
Latham has a very mixed. I rated Latham. When I left, I took with me 4 partners. They then got burned because of their litigation against Chevron, which was a client of Latham's. So Latham has a bad taste for litigation finance, but it's changing now. It's becoming much more friendly to it. It's going to have to. You have to be friendly to funders, otherwise you're going to have a competitive advantage. And it gets back to a point I was making earlier, which is that this industry is not only for claimants who can't afford it, it's becoming a choice for claimants who can afford it, maybe 20% of the market, who can afford it but want to have funding themselves because it's, they hive off risk and so on. And that's a growing, that will become at least 50% of the market. So there is another, and that's part of the audience for clients for major law firms.
I'll mention too, since you brought it up, Burford does indeed publish quite a bit of material. We have an annual investor report by virtue of being publicly traded, but we also have a condensed version of that is designed to introduce people who are less familiar with what we do to the nature of the work that we do, as well as our financial performance. We also publish articles quarterly about specific elements of the market.
Yeah.
So I've published, for example, on intellectual property matters in the university sector. There are several of us at Burford who are subject matter experts in our respective fields. My colleague Jeffrey Commission, for example, is an international arbitration expert. He's written a book on his practice and writes frequently for us on issues related to litigation or arbitration finance. There's more out there than you think. I think it is true that there's no better teacher than experience, but to some extent it's good to walk in informed and really understand what you can know about the industry. It varies with the nature of different funders that operate in the space, be they private fund or public fund capital. But there's more out there than you might initially think you can learn.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say, wearing the Harvard Law School hat, we just launched Amicus, our alumni mentoring network. So I sure hope that you both are in it, and this is a great place for our students to look as a first starting point. So I encourage you both, if you haven't already done so, to sign up for Amicus. I want to turn it over. Are there any questions from the audience?
Well, while people are thinking of their questions, and just for the video and out here, if anybody wants to speak to a potential mentor in this industry, I'm more than happy to make myself
Good for
available.
you.
I'll sign up. But for me, the great benefits actually of being outside of the law firm world is I have a lot of time to do this mentoring work that I really enjoyed inside the firm, and I'm happy to be available. So.
Great. I'm sure this is an amazing panel, and this to me would be a great starting point for anybody who's thinking about a career. Robert, did you have a question?
Sure. I was wondering, obviously, one way to join this industry is to join an existing fund. But I'm sure, and I've heard rumblings among the students, another way is to start a fund. And if someone was genuinely interested in doing so, do you have advice? Maybe that advice is don't do it. But do that advice and words of caution.
I'm repeating this for the tape so it gets picked up. If one way is to join, a fund. Robert's question is, what about starting a fund, and is that a good idea?
It's crazy. You'll never succeed if you just go out and start a fund out of law school. You're going to be dooming yourself to failure. You've got to get some experience, whether it's at a law firm or at a fund, before you even think about something like that. So my reaction is never do it.
Yeah, I did it.
Well, that's what I
did it,
mean.
but I think, Selwyn, you're right. I think the obstacles that you have to go across, you're right, you want to be out of your mind. So therefore, it is very, very difficult because you need to be up at 6 in the morning, maybe even 5 a.m. and work until 12 and 1 o'clock at night to try and get somewhere. And also, to open your own fund, you need money. Because obviously the first thing you need to do is be able to deploy some capital into the market that you're looking at. We set up in a very simple market, which is the consumer lending to litigation to plaintiffs for personal injury, which are obviously very easy to read. And we set a record across those claims, which allowed us 3 or 4 years later to go to institutional investors and then to try and get additional monies. But it was all our own money that we used for the first large number of years. So, yeah, it's everyone's right. I think very difficult. Very difficult, but if you have a heart of a lion and a work ethic of a hunter that won't stop, then take a go at it, Robert, definitely.
And unlimited capital.
Well, you can prove yourself with maybe, you still need money. So rich parents is a good idea, good friends, but to be honest with you, it takes a lot of work. So I would suggest you should never ever say ever, never, no matter what industry you're in or who you are, because there's always a way. And I think Selwyn is right, though. It would be difficult to go straight out and maybe go into a legal firm, learn your trade, look at where you are, and then maybe have a think about it afterwards.
So one way to, as we're wrapping up, I thought what might be nice is if each of you, we could start with Emily, one piece of advice for someone who is thinking about a career in litigation funding.
Piece of advice. Again, this would be a little particular from my perspective. Don't conceive of yourself so narrowly. When I went to law school, people were trying to hire electrical engineers hand over fist to do patent litigation. There was quite a bit of pressure or suggestion that I focus 100% of my chosen studies on things that would relate to technology litigation. And I chose to spend half of my time as a 203L at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. And what I learned operationally about running what is essentially a miniature law firm is actually incredibly useful to me now in what I do. I don't think I knew that at the time, but I don't suppose you can know how the different things that you experience in law school are going to come together someday. So I would encourage you not to think of yourself as having to focus full bore on doing this thing that you think you ought to do, but focus more on what your strengths and weaknesses are and the things that sing to you. So for me, I did study some substantive things that I think were helpful to me, but I also made time for things that fell outside of that, but somehow I felt would complete my vision of my abilities. So don't conceive of yourself so narrowly. It's good to have focus and have some dedication, but make sure that you introduce some complexity into your knowledge.
Great. Ian?
I think to surround yourself by brilliant people and people that you respect, people that you look up to, people that you feel would add something and add value to yourself. I think all of us in this room are learning every single day, every day. And today I've learned so much from speaking to my peers in this room. I think never believe you have got the end or you're there, because you're you know what I mean? We have a saying in Ireland that a pat on the back is 6 inches from a kick up the behind. So just keep yourself focused on who you are, what you're about. Get someone that can mentor you. Look to people who you respect and try and see, can you do similar.
So I'll come at this answer in a bit of a roundabout way. When I was a first-year associate at then Hogan & Hartson, we were a firm that was very much, we always home grow our partners. I remember being a summer associate and seeing the then chairman of the firm, Warren Gorell, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and putting a Hogan & Hartson flag at the top. That was very much the ethos there. And a partner that I really respected said, and he had been there 25 years, was a summer associate there. He said, I never hung anything on my walls because I didn't want to be stuck. I didn't want to feel like I couldn't leave because, I had just planted myself here. And I took that to heart, and even when I made partner, I was like, I'm just not putting anything up on the walls because I only want to stay so long as I'm really loving it and fulfilled by my practice. And I want to feel like if the right opportunity comes, I can leave for it. And that's what happened for me at Therium, and I'm incredibly fulfilled. And in fact, my time at Hogan Lovells was so fulfilling because I knew that I was going there every day because I had a practice I loved. And that practice actually changed for me. I started out thinking I wanted to do government regulatory work, found out I loved litigating, then it morphed into this tech focus where I was doing arbitration as well. I did some patent litigation even though I have no engineering background. So I think my advice is probably less specific to litigation finance, but what I've found has made it such a fulfilling career for me now at Therium, and that led me all along is I'm really energized by what I do, and it wasn't that I started out, 10 years ago thinking, well, this is where I want to get, and just you have to be unwavering. It's not like every day I walked into Hogan Levels thinking, I just really want to bill 16 hours today. But I loved my work, and I love what I do now, and so I think you have to find that passion and be willing to let yourself move away from what you thought you wanted to do. And don't be afraid to do that. It was a huge leap for me to make a partner and then jump off a cliff, as far as probably some of my partners felt. But I looked at, okay, well, what's my upside? They made me a nice offer. And what's my downside risk? Okay, I walked away from the partnership, but I have this wide base of experience. I feel confident in my abilities, and I know that, let's say we make terrible investment decisions, knock on wood, we've had a great track record so far, and the money all dries up, I'm gonna figure something out. And that for me has been, that knowledge inside myself, I think, has been what has helped me take those leaps that have really put my career on the upward trajectory.
Selvin, you got the final word.
I'm inspired by every one of the three panelists, and I think every one of them has taken a path that probably is beyond each of our reach. So to follow their path may be impossible, but there they are. I would suggest to any law student that they treat the law curriculum as a liberal arts experience, where they take whatever they can in the legal, financial, business world, and ideally take a JD with a business degree, and then choose a law firm that is what I call funder friendly. And there are many, as I mentioned. It just takes a little bit of searching at this moment to find them. In 2 years from now, they'll be all over the place. But then to join a firm that's funder friendly and use one's career training to really get embedded in that part of the firm's practice. That, I think, will allow them in 2 or 3 years to decide whether to stay with the firm or to go with a funder. And there's going to be plenty of jobs. In fact, Elizabeth, she's not as brave as you might think, because if this dried up at Therium, she would go right back to Hogan Lovells. They would welcome her with open arms. So I think someone who's good in this industry has the world of opportunities within the law practice or within the industry.
Well, what fantastic advice, and what a fantastic panel. So please join me in thanking our esteemed panel for providing such wonderful and practical advice today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You were terrific.
Thanks for the good questions.